The sun peeked through the tall skyscrapers of Manhattan as Malcolm Evans adjusted his bright blue uniform and secured the name tag on his chest. He walked briskly toward Metromart, the busy supermarket where he had worked for the past 3 years. The chill of the winter morning was tempered by the warmth of anticipation that Malcolm felt every time he stepped into his workplace. The automatic doors swished open, releasing a wave of heated air mixed with the familiar scent of freshly baked bread. A cacophony of early shoppers greeted Malcolm, a hum of conversations, the squeaking of cartwheels, and the beeping of registers filling the store. Despite the chaos, Malcolm smiled. He thrived in this environment where no 2 days were alike. "Morning, Malcolm," called out Jenny, a young cashier, balancing college classes and a part-time job. She waved at him from Register 3. "Morning, Jenny." "Ready for another day of holiday madness?" Malcolm teased, giving her a playful grin. She laughed, rolling her eyes. "Barely, but you make it look easy." Malcolm chuckled and headed to his assigned register. He had built a reputation for efficiency and charm, greeting every customer with genuine warmth. Regulars often lined up specifically for him, knowing they'd leave not only with groceries, but also with a little extra joy. Ethan Reynolds, the store manager, stood at the front of the store, clipboard in hand, scanning the aisles with his usual intensity. Tall and broad-shouldered, Ethan exuded authority, but his approachable demeanor made him respected rather than feared. He caught sight of Malcolm and gave him a nod. "Morning, Malcolm. Ready to tackle another day?" "Always," Malcolm replied confidently. By mid-morning, the store was teeming with holiday shoppers. Malcolm moved swiftly, scanning items with precision and exchanging pleasantries with customers. A young mother struggled with her toddler, who kept tossing candy bars onto the conveyor belt. Malcolm distracted the child with a quick magic trick involving a quarter, eliciting giggles and a grateful smile from the mother. As the line at Malcolm's register grew, so did the holiday tension among customers. But he remained unflappable, his calm demeanor a beacon in the storm. That's when she walked in. Mrs. Charlotte Whitmore, draped in a fur coat and clutching a designer handbag, stepped through the automatic doors. Her sharp features and haughty air commanded attention. She paused to survey the bustling scene, her lip curling slightly in disdain. She navigated the aisles with purpose, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. By the time she reached the checkout area, her cart was filled with high-end groceries. She joined Malcolm's line, her impatience evident as she tapped her manicured nails on the handle of her cart. Malcolm noticed her, but maintained his usual professionalism. As the line moved forward, Mrs. Whitmore's irritation grew. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward, only to freeze as her eyes met Malcolm's. "You," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Malcolm greeted her politely. "How can I assist you today?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "I'd like a different cashier," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the checkout area. Malcolm blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I'd be happy to assist you, ma'am. Is there a specific issue?" "I just don't want you handling my groceries," she snapped, her tone cold and final. A hush fell over the nearby registers. Shoppers and employees alike turned to watch the unfolding scene. Malcolm's co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to intervene. Malcolm stood tall, his voice steady. "I assure you, ma'am, I can provide excellent service." Mrs. Whitmore scoffed, her cheeks flushing with irritation. "I'll wait for someone else," she insisted, folding her arms across her chest. The awkward silence stretched on, the tension in the air palpable. Malcolm glanced over at Ethan, who was already striding toward them, his expression unreadable. "What seems to be the problem here?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but firm. Mrs. Whitmore turned to him, her expression brightening slightly, as if she expected him to side with her. "I'd like another cashier. I shouldn't have to explain myself." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "We don't assign customers to specific cashiers, ma'am. Malcolm here is one of our best employees." Mrs. Whitmore sniffed, clearly unimpressed. "I have the right to choose who serves me." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "And I have the responsibility to ensure all my employees are treated with respect." The tension in the room grew thicker as shoppers and staff watched the exchange. Malcolm remained silent, his hands clenched behind the register as he waited to see how the situation would unfold. Mrs. Whitmore's face turned red with indignation. "Are you saying you're taking his side?" she demanded. "I'm saying that discrimination has no place in this store," Ethan replied evenly. The confrontation had everyone holding their breath, the moment teetering on the edge of chaos. Malcolm, still calm but visibly hurt, met Ethan's gaze, silently urging him to maintain control of the situation. And Ethan, as always, rose to the occasion. The tension in the air was electric. Every eye in the immediate vicinity was locked on the standoff at Malcolm's register. For a moment, even the incessant beeping of nearby scanners seemed to pause as Mrs. Charlotte Whitmore's icy words hung in the air. Malcolm's co-workers shifted uneasily, unsure if they should intervene or remain silent. Malcolm stood tall, his posture betraying none of the hurt her words caused. Years of working in customer service had taught him patience, but this was different. This wasn't just a rude shopper. This was open disdain, directed at him for reasons that went beyond groceries or service. Mrs. Whitmore crossed her arms and raised her voice so that the surrounding crowd could hear. "I don't see why I should be forced to accept service from someone like him." The murmur of discomfort rippled through the crowd. Several customers exchanged glances, some lowering their eyes in embarrassment. A few even stepped out of line, seemingly reluctant to witness the drama unfold. Malcolm inhaled deeply, steadying himself. His voice was calm and even, though there was an unmistakable edge of resolve in it. "Ma'am, I'm here to help you, as I am for every customer. If you'd prefer not to use this register, you're welcome to another line." Mrs. Whitmore sneered. "Oh, now you're telling me where I can and can't shop." Before Malcolm could respond, Ethan Reynolds stepped forward. The store manager's commanding presence brought an immediate hush to the area. His clipboard was tucked under his arm, and his sharp blue eyes flicked between Malcolm and Mrs. Whitmore. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it?" Ethan asked, his voice measured and authoritative. "Yes," she replied, her chin tilting upward. "And who are you?" "I'm Ethan Reynolds, the manager of this store," he said, his tone calm but firm. "And I believe there's a misunderstanding here." "Oh, there's no misunderstanding," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "I have every right to decide who handles my belongings, and I choose not to be served by—" She gestured dismissively at Malcolm. "Him." Ethan's jaw tightened. He inhaled sharply before speaking, choosing his words with care. "Ma'am, at Metromart, we have a policy that prioritizes respect and dignity for everyone. That includes our customers and our employees." Mrs. Whitmore rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with condescension. "Well, maybe you should prioritize customer preferences." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. "Respect isn't negotiable here, Mrs. Whitmore. If you can't treat my staff with basic decency, I'll have to ask you to leave." A collective gasp escaped the crowd. Even Malcolm blinked in surprise, his stoic mask slipping for just a moment. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed, her indignation rendering her temporarily speechless. Finally, she sputtered, "You can't be serious. Do you have any idea who I am?" Ethan remained unfazed. "I know exactly who you are, a customer, and like any customer, you're expected to follow our policies. Discrimination has no place in this store." The crowd began to murmur again, this time with a mix of approval and tension. A few customers nodded subtly, while others whispered to one another. Malcolm, still standing silently at the register, felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. He appreciated Ethan's defense, but he wasn't used to being the center of such a public spectacle. Mrs. Whitmore, however, was far from finished. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Reynolds. I'll be calling corporate to report this outrage. I spend thousands of dollars here every year, and I'll make sure they know how poorly I've been treated." Ethan crossed his arms, his expression calm but unyielding. "You're welcome to call corporate, ma'am. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to either complete your purchase or leave the store." Mrs. Whitmore's face turned an alarming shade of red. She opened her mouth to retort, but was interrupted by a voice from the line behind her. "Ma'am, just let the man do his job," said a middle-aged man holding a basket of groceries. His tone was firm, and his expression was one of quiet frustration. Several other customers murmured their agreement, emboldened by Ethan's stance. Yeah, he's doing fine, another customer added. You're the one holding up the line. Mrs. Whitmore whipped around to face the crowd, her expression incredulous. Oh, so now I'm the villain here, she exclaimed. All I wanted was… Ethan raised a hand, cutting her off. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to finish your transaction or leave. The choice is yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Whitmore glared at Ethan, then at Malcolm, and finally at the gathered crowd. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment it seemed as though she might relent. But then, with a dramatic huff, she abandoned her cart and stormed out of the store, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. As the automatic doors swished closed behind her, a smattering of applause broke out among the customers. Ethan turned to Malcolm, his expression softening. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Malcolm nodded, though his jaw was tight. I'm fine. Thank you, Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. You handled that better than most people would have. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Malcolm gave a small, appreciative nod, though his thoughts were racing. Incidents like this weren't new to him, but they never got easier. He was grateful for Ethan's support, but part of him couldn't shake the lingering sting of Mrs. Whitmore's words. As the day went on, the buzz from the confrontation slowly faded. Customers came and went, and Malcolm returned to his usual rhythm. But as he scanned groceries and greeted shoppers, he couldn't help but wonder, would there ever come a day when moments like this were truly a thing of the past? The confrontation might have ended, but the echoes of it lingered. For Malcolm, it wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice, but it was among the most public and humiliating. He went about the rest of his shift with practiced professionalism, though every smile felt heavier than usual. Ethan, on the other hand, was determined not to let the incident pass without resolution. As soon as the store quieted down, he pulled Malcolm aside to the staff break room. It was a modest space, with a coffee machine that groaned with age and chairs that wobbled slightly, but it was private. Take a seat, Ethan said, motioning to a chair. His voice was calm, but Malcolm could see the concern etched in his features. Malcolm sat, folding his hands in his lap. I appreciate you stepping in earlier, Ethan. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Ethan said firmly, pulling up a chair to sit across from him. No one should have to deal with that kind of behavior, especially not here. But I need to know. Are you really okay? If you want to report this higher up, I'll back you 100%. Malcolm hesitated. I'm okay, he said, though the words felt forced. Honestly, it's not the first time someone said something like that to me. It's just part of the job sometimes. Ethan's jaw tightened. It shouldn't be. There was a long pause. Malcolm stared down at his hands, unsure of what to say. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You know, Ethan began, his voice softer now, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I've never said out loud before, but after what happened today, I think it's time. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Ethan took a deep breath, his expression turning introspective. A few years ago, my son, Caleb, went missing in the city. He was only 9 at the time, too young to be wandering around alone. My wife and I were frantic, calling the police, driving around, doing everything we could to find him. Hours passed, and we were losing hope. Malcolm nodded slowly, wondering where the story was going. Then, out of nowhere, we got a call from a stranger, Ethan continued. He told us he'd found Caleb sitting on a park bench, scared out of his mind. When we got there, this man, this kind, patient man, had not only kept Caleb safe, but had also bought him a hot dog to calm him down. Ethan's voice cracked slightly as he paused. That man was you, Malcolm. Malcolm blinked, the memory rushing back like a flood. Caleb, he murmured. I remember now. He was wearing a little blue jacket, wasn't he? Said he got separated from his mom while chasing a balloon. Ethan smiled faintly. That's the one. You didn't just find him. You stayed with him, comforted him, and made sure he was okay until we got there. I never got to properly thank you for that. You don't need to thank me, Malcolm said, shaking his head. Any decent person would have done the same. But that's the thing, Ethan said, leaning forward. Not everyone would have. And that act of kindness stuck with me. It's one of the reasons I hired you. I knew you were someone who cared about people, someone who would make the store better just by being here. Malcolm was silent, his throat tightening. He hadn't thought much about that day in years, but hearing Ethan's gratitude now brought unexpected emotion to the surface. "I had no idea," Malcolm said quietly. "I was just doing what felt right." Ethan smiled. "And that's exactly why I stood up for you today. You're more than just an employee, Malcolm. You're someone who makes a difference." The weight of Ethan's words settled over Malcolm like a warm blanket. For the first time that day, the knot in his chest began to loosen. He gave a small nod, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." Before they could say more, the break room door swung open, and Sarah, one of the younger cashiers, peeked inside. "Hey, Ethan." "Corporate's on the line." "I think it's about that lady from earlier." Ethan sighed, standing up. "I'll handle it. You take as much time as you need, Malcolm." As Ethan left, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, replaying their conversation in his mind. He couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude, not just for Ethan's support, but for the reminder that small acts of kindness could have far-reaching effects. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread through the store and beyond. Customers began approaching Malcolm, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own stories of dealing with prejudice. Some even brought in thank you cards or small tokens of appreciation, inspired by what they'd witnessed. Ethan, true to his word, took the matter seriously. He contacted corporate, not to defend himself, but to advocate for stronger anti-discrimination policies within the company. He also began organizing a diversity and inclusion training program for the store's staff, determined to turn the incident into a teachable moment. One day, as Malcolm finished ringing up a customer, a familiar figure walked into the store, Mrs. Whitmore. She was subdued this time, her usual air of entitlement replaced by a hesitance that bordered on nervousness. Malcolm's stomach tightened as she approached the counter, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. She placed them on the counter, avoiding his gaze. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came to apologize for the way I acted the other day." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to say. "I was wrong," she continued, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Ethan explained some things to me and, well, I realized I made a fool of myself. I'm sorry." Malcolm studied her for a moment, searching her expression for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. Mrs. Whitmore offered a small, awkward smile before turning to leave. Malcolm watched her go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't sure if her apology made up for her behavior, but he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. As the day went on, Malcolm reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about Ethan's words, the support of the customers, and even Mrs. Whitmore's reluctant apology. It wasn't a perfect world, but moments like these gave him hope that things could change, and for the first time in a long time, that hope felt real. The days following Mrs. Whitmore's apology marked a turning point for Malcolm, the supermarket, and the community it served. The story of the incident had spread beyond the walls of the store, shared on social media and local news outlets, igniting conversations about bias, respect, and the importance of taking a stand. Ethan wasted no time in implementing changes. He worked closely with corporate to introduce a diversity and inclusion program tailored to the store's unique dynamics. The program included workshops, guest speakers, and team-building activities that encouraged employees to confront their own biases and foster an environment of respect. Malcolm, initially hesitant to be the center of attention, found himself becoming a quiet leader in the effort. Ethan had asked him to share his perspective during the first workshop, and while the thought of speaking in front of his coworkers made him nervous, Malcolm agreed. On the day of the workshop, the break room had been transformed into a makeshift training space. Rows of chairs were set up facing a small podium, and a projector displayed the words, "Building Bridges, Fostering Inclusion in the Workplace." Malcolm stood off to the side, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. His palms were clammy, and his heart raced as the employees filed in, chatting quietly among themselves. Ethan approached him, offering a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You'll do great," Ethan said. "Just speak from the heart." When it was time to begin, Ethan stepped up to the podium to introduce Malcolm. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from someone who embodies the values we're striving for. Malcolm has been a pillar of this store, not just for his work ethic, but for the kindness and resilience he shows every day. Let's give him a warm welcome. The room erupted in applause as Malcolm made his way to the front. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I'm not used to speaking in front of a crowd, so bear with me." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, easing some of Malcolm's tension. "I wanted to talk about what happened last week, not because it was easy to go through, but because it's important to talk about. When Mrs. Whitmore made those comments, it hurt. Not just because of what she said, but because it reminded me of how often people like me have to prove our worth just to be treated like everyone else." The room was silent, the employees hanging on his every word. "But here's the thing," Malcolm continued. "That moment could have gone in a very different direction if not for Ethan stepping in. He didn't just defend me, he made it clear that this store stands for something bigger. That's the kind of leadership we need, not just here, but everywhere." Malcolm paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I'm sharing this because I want us to think about how we treat each other, not just when things go wrong, but every day. It's the little moments that add up. A kind word, a helping hand, standing up for someone when they're being mistreated. Those things matter more than we realize." When Malcolm finished, the room erupted into applause. Several employees approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty and sharing how his words had resonated with them. The changes Ethan implemented weren't just about policies. They extended to the culture of the store. Employees began to look out for one another in new ways, fostering a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. Customers noticed the shift too, commenting on the welcoming atmosphere and the way the staff seemed genuinely happy to be there. Ethan also launched a community outreach initiative inspired by Malcolm's actions years ago when he helped Caleb. The store partnered with local organizations to support underprivileged families, offering food drives, job training programs, and mentorship opportunities. Malcolm found himself becoming a key figure in these efforts. He volunteered to mentor young people in the community, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to pursue their dreams despite the obstacles they might face. One evening, as Malcolm was restocking shelves, Ethan approached him with a grin. "Got a minute?" Ethan asked. "Sure," Malcolm replied, setting down a box of cereal. Ethan led him to his office, where a neatly printed certificate sat on the desk. He handed it to Malcolm with a smile. "What's this?" Malcolm asked, scanning the document. "It's a promotion," Ethan said. "You've been an incredible asset to this store, and it's time you were recognized for it. Starting next week, you'll be the assistant manager." Malcolm blinked, his mouth falling open. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Ethan said. "You've earned it, Malcolm, and I couldn't think of anyone better to help lead this team." Emotions swelled in Malcolm's chest as he looked at the certificate. He thought about everything that had led him to this moment, the struggles, the prejudices he'd faced, and the small acts of kindness that had made all the difference. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Ethan said, clapping him on the back. "You've already proven that 100 times over." As the weeks turned into months, the supermarket became a symbol of unity and resilience in the community. Customers continued to share stories about the positive changes they'd noticed, and the store's reputation soared. Malcolm embraced his new role with the same dedication and kindness that had always defined him. He took pride in mentoring new employees, helping them navigate the challenges of the job while fostering a culture of respect and inclusivity. One day, as he was closing up the store, a young boy approached him. The boy, no older than 10, looked up at Malcolm with wide eyes. "Are you the man from the story?" the boy asked. "The one who stood up to the mean lady?" Malcolm chuckled. "I guess I am." The boy grinned. "That's cool. My mom says you're a hero." Malcolm smiled, feeling a warmth that no words could describe. "Tell your mom I said thank you." As the boy ran off, Malcolm looked around the store, now quiet and still. He thought about how far he'd come and how much further there was to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt truly hopeful. Because in this little corner of the world, change had taken root. And it all started with a moment of courage. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of kindness, integrity, and the courage to stand against prejudice. Malcolm's story reminds us that even in the face of adversity, resilience and compassion can inspire real change. It's about the power of community, the strength of standing up for what's right, and the ripple effect of doing good. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're listening from. Be sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another story that challenges, inspires, and uplifts. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay strong, and remember, small acts of courage can create big waves of change.